Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Dalhousie Faculty of Medicine's newest podcast, Leadership PRN. This podcast is intended for anyone interested in effective medical leadership, whether in the clinical setting or the academic center. I'm your host, Dr. Lara Hazelton. I practice general psychiatry and work part-time in continuing professional development at the medical school. Our faculty development team creates programs to support faculty in their roles as teachers, scholars, and leaders. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Laura Neals. She's the Director of Academic Staff Relations here at Dalhousie. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Laura, can you tell us about your background and your role with Dalhousie?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a practicing labor lawyer, I suppose, by trade. I was called to the bar here in Nova Scotia in 2013. I primarily practiced union side labor law and then transitioned into the academic environment where I've been working in human resources. So here at Dal, as you mentioned, I'm the Director of Academic Staff Relations, which means I represent the university and sort of all of its dealings with its academic staff. And right now I'm serving as one of the acting assistant VPs of HR.
That sounds like an interesting and challenging position for you.
There is never a dull moment in my day.
So can you tell us a little bit about what you do in these roles, Laura?
Yeah, absolutely. I say to folks, normally if I'm coming to your office, it's because something's gone awry. I usually am the person that gets called in to troubleshoot problems. So it could be something quite small, how to support an employee who's having performance issues, or something quite large, which would be a multiple person conflict in a department, or perhaps a restructuring. So it really runs the range of all things related to how people are performing and interacting in their workplace.
And you mentioned that it's at Dalhousie, so some of our listeners are probably physicians, department heads in clinical academic departments. So there'd be something similar at the hospital, or at the health authority? Is that how it usually works?
It's interesting. In my role, we support some of the clinical departments because most folks also have academic appointments through Dalhousie. So that's typically the point of connection. Of course, there are lots of HR supports through the health authority and individual hospitals. But the HR department at Dal is also here for any folks that have academic appointments or are supervising learners through Dalhousie's.
Right. So that academic role of being a supervisor, a teacher, is part of what you would see in your role with Dalhousie.
That's right. Clinical department heads, as you know, wear a lot of hats, and a lot of those hats have to do with managing people. So we're really here to sort of support that and make sure that those relationships go well.
Can you explain, one of the terms that we hear a lot is disruptive behavior. We hear about disruptive physicians managing disruptive behavior. Can you explain for us what is meant by that term?
I mean, I guess I would start by saying disruptive behavior is really in the eye of the beholder. What is disruptive in one setting for one particular group of people may not be disruptive for others. So it really requires not only listening to your own intuition, but listening to those around you. So when you're trying to identify, is this disruptive behavior? What is disruptive behavior? You need to consider your experience and the experiences of those working with you. So as an example, disruptive behavior could be something like a microaggression, the tone that you use when speaking to your colleagues that makes people feel uncomfortable or unsafe in a workplace. Or it could be a violent shouting outburst. I think, of course, the more extreme examples are easier to identify, and there's probably more consensus around what those disruptive behaviors look like. The smaller ones are harder to spot. And I think sometimes for leaders, it's easy for those things to go unnoticed. I mean, department heads are very busy people. You may not be aware of the tones that people are using, or, the order in which people are called on to contribute in workplace settings. So I think keeping a really broad lens on what is disruptive behavior helps to understand the different experiences that people have in workplaces.
How do you think disruptive behavior usually comes to the attention of department heads? Because as you're saying, people may have different perspectives, or department heads aren't always seeing all the interactions. How do you think this usually arises as an issue?
In my experience, it's usually flagged by someone in the department. So someone will come to the department head to say, I'm having an issue with Dr. X. And then it's sort of on the department head to try and address or deal with it. So that ends up being a reactive scenario. The behavior's happened, it's potentially gone unchecked, it's impacted an employee or a colleague, and then it needs to be addressed. So that's the standard scenario that we see. Sometimes clinical department heads will raise things in a more proactive context. So they'll ask for advice because they've noticed a behavior or seen something happening, and they want to know, how can I be a good ally to this person in my workplace? How can I check the behavior before it becomes a problem? And then I suppose the third way would be not so much someone having concerns about the behavior of another person, but noticing that someone in a department is struggling and that their behavior is potentially impacting operations or how things are getting done or not done. I mean, sometimes disruptive behavior is an action, or sometimes it is a lack of action that is impacting other people.
Explain that last one. It can be a lack of action?
Sure. A disruptive behavior may be someone not showing up to work. It could be someone not responding to emails. It could be someone potentially ignoring a coworker and creating a situation where there's not good communication happening. Things are falling through the cracks. Stuff's getting missed. So it's sort of the absence of their participation and engagement that's causing the disruption.
It's interesting. I wouldn't have thought of that as being a type of disruptive behavior. I guess I think more of the anger, outbursts, antagonism, undermining.
Yeah, the violent behavior, the bullying, the harassment, those are the kind of, like I said, easiest to spot. But there's lots of ways that work patterns and relationships are impacted by disruptive behavior. And like I said, it can be more subtle.
Thinking about some of those examples you gave of people not responding to emails, one of the things we talk about a lot in medicine is professionalism. I don't know if that's a lens that you hear applied to your work with physicians or not.
Absolutely. I mean, these are workplaces at the end of the day, and I think expectations of professionalism help us decide what behavior is acceptable and what behavior isn't acceptable. But I think often we have to look at these behaviors through a variety of lenses. So yes, is it professional? Is it hostile? Does it signal a health crisis? Is there something happening in someone's personal life? We come to work as full people with full lives. So I think we need to sort of approach our assessment with that same broad sort of full consideration of what is the root cause of the behavior, and then that helps us decide how we want to address it.
Because a lot of the people listening to this podcast would be from the medical environment, I'm wondering, do you think disruptive behavior in the healthcare setting is significantly different from other settings like the university?
I think it's probably different in the sense that the environments can be higher stakes, so the impacts can be greater. I think disruptive behavior looks very similar no matter the workplace it plays out in. It sort of shows up in the same ways. But I certainly recognize that some of these workplaces that our physicians are in are high stakes, high pressure, and if there are breakdowns in communication or things falling through the cracks, the consequences can be far beyond what they would be in some of the more traditional academic environments.
What are your suggestions for dealing with disruptive behavior? What advice do you give to people especially leaders, when you're brought into a situation?
Yeah, I mean, so much of it depends on what the behavior is. I think when folks come to me and they want to talk about something proactively, so maybe the behavior has not festered into a conflict within their area or department, but they're just noticing issues with one or several employees that are starting to cause a couple problems or they're concerned about. Sometimes it just comes from a place of concern. So my approach is always, let's start from a sort of caring, person-centered perspective. You're going to sit down with the employee in question and just have a conversation. What's going on? I've been noticing maybe you're not showing up on time, or you're forgetting to do these things, or I noticed when you spoke to our colleague, you used a really sharp tone. Is there something going on? So just having that sort of first level inquiry. And as I said before, people are bringing their whole lives to the workplace, and sometimes there are things that they need to vent about or they need supports about. If things are happening in their personal lives, often there are things we can do to help support them. So identifying those are kind of the first step. So that caring colleague conversation is step one. And if that happens and yields nothing, or the person doesn't disclose there's anything happening, then I encourage leaders to use their power that they have in a lot of workplace settings to flag concerns and problematic behavior. So if you notice a colleague is using a sharp tone with someone, to note it and to say it in the moment, to say, oh, I don't think you meant for that comment to come across that way, but your voice was a little sharp, or using your position of power to set norms and standards for what appropriate behavior is really helpful, and I think can be helpful when you're working with junior colleagues or even people who are new to your workplace and may not understand your workplace norms. So helping to shape that culture and set a standard for what appropriate behavior looks like. So those are the proactive things: noticing behaviors in the moment and addressing them, having caring conversations when you're noticing that people are struggling, either in their interactions with one another or individually. In terms of reactive, so the problem has arisen, and there's some sort of conflict or disruption brewing. We need to assess what the root cause is. I mean, often the disruptive behavior is the symptom, but it's not the actual problem. So then we ask department heads to sort of start out on a fact-finding mission as to what is the actual problem that's underlying the behavior. And again, this is going to start with a conversation with those involved. What's been happening? What do you think is going on here? I've been noticing some tension. Just having those frank, open conversations, not coming in with a lens of this behavior is unacceptable and must stop, but really a curious lens about what's going on here. Not to say that those conversations, this is unacceptable and it must stop, won't happen at some point, but I think those initial assessments, you're really trying to get at what's the cause here and what's the problem. And I think for leaders, you always want to be working towards creating an environment where people feel comfortable talking to you. So coming in with a very authoritative approach can really shut down communication and can prevent people from bringing issues to you. So I think, again, being open, having those initial conversations. As things start to percolate up, so maybe you find out someone's having a problem at home, or there was a conflict arising over how a decision was made. People aren't agreeing professionally. People don't get along. They don't like each other. The range of things is significant. I think then you want to call in your neighborhood HR professional, and it could be, someone connected with your department. It could be someone connected with the Faculty of Medicine who has wonderful HR support. It could be myself, someone from Central HR at Dalhousie, or some of the resources that exist through the health authority or the hospital. And they'll be excellent at helping you work through what kind of supports and resources are needed. And that's usually sort of step one of the assessment. And sometimes that's enough to correct the behavior. but sometimes it's not. And a lot of times these situations end up being not sprints, but marathons. And for leaders, that can be quite exhausting, but it's important to remember that the attention that you are giving the situation is going to yield sort of the results that you want. So if you're just trying to do a one and done fix it, you're probably not going to get the results that you want. But if you're committed to following through, following up, checking back in, continuing to set strong norms for what appropriate behavior is and enforcing those norms, then often you'll see that reflected in your department's work culture. But it does take time. And it is a long-term labor of love, I would say.
Sometimes I think department heads hope that maybe if they ignore things, they'll go away. Have you encountered that before?
Yes, often because it has not gone away and it has gotten 100 times worse. And I'm sure most of them rue the day that they decided to turn a blind eye. My other favorite is sometimes people take over as department head and they get a big, manila envelope or file folder of the previous department head's notes on a particular person they want to make them aware of, but they never dealt with. And I think that's a shame to enter a department with that kind of baggage, because you're really having to undo years and years of people coming to believe that inappropriate behavior is appropriate. So I wish it just went away on its own, but I guess if it did, I wouldn't have much of a job. So maybe I should be grateful these things take time. But in general, it's always easier to deal with things at the outset because they tend to be smaller problems. So an example would be, someone is struggling. Maybe they're having some mental health issues or stress in their life. If you're able to address it at the outset and provide them with some supports, it's possible they're able to address their own behavior, kind of get back on track, and then return to being a full contributor to the department. If you ignore it and you hope it gets better, or sometimes it comes from a very genuine place of caring where the person says, I'm going to cut them slack because I know they're going through something, so I'm not going to raise it with them and I'm not going to address it because I care about them and they're my friend. But then what happens is it starts to impact others. And then simmering tensions emerge in the department, and then those are left unchecked, and then those tensions become full-scale conflict, and then those are left unchecked, and then it becomes true fractures in working relationships where people can't even work together or be in the same room. People aren't attending department meetings because they don't want to interact with one another. So what could have been addressed at the outset ends up impacting the whole department. One person's issue can kind of spiral and become the issue of 7 or 10 different people. So, I think the sooner the better is always the answer. And it's always the least painful answer too. So I think, if folks have situations brewing and they hope they'll pass, I can almost guarantee your listeners they will not. And I would hope that they would feel comfortable, reaching out for support. I think sometimes the obstacles to people addressing them are them not knowing what to do. And fair enough. I mean, when you manage people, the problems are so wide-ranging. How could you have a playbook for every scenario? And that's certainly not our expectation of physicians. We want you to access help and expertise when you need it. So if you're noticing things and you're not sure how to deal with them, again, contact your neighborhood HR professional, because they're here to help you and can be a really excellent resource. And the other thing that I would say, just in terms of being proactive in addressing disruptive behavior, is you have so much power as a leader to set the norm for for your workplace. The way that you're interacting with people is a signal to everyone working with you about how they should be interacting with people. So if you're being mindful about how you're coming across to people, the language that you're using, the way that you're interacting and communicating, you're also working to build the culture in your department and to educate people about what behavior is appropriate in the workplace. So leading by example is a great way to just proactively address this on a daily basis.
Role modeling, essentially.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Sometimes leaders say I've witnessed this having worked in organizations for 20 years, they'll say to people, well, if you don't have a solution, don't come to me with a problem unless you have a solution. What do you think of that as a response from a leader to say that when people come to them?
It sounds very convenient. And wouldn't that be nice if people just came to you with answers instead of problems? But I think it denies the reality of being in a leadership role, which is really that you are there to lead. And often what that means is you're going to get difficult questions and problems, and no one expects you to have the answer, but they expect you to work through the problem. And that may mean, again, accessing outside resources. But I think as leaders, we don't have the option of pushing problems back on those who are working with us. We have an obligation to kind of roll up your sleeves, wade into the mud together, and I think I can't stress enough, these are anything to do with HR ends up being really complicated, right? People are difficult, conversations are difficult. Conflict can feel uncomfortable and awkward. It can feel strange to ask somebody, is there anything going on with you that I should know about, or I'm noticing these behaviors? Those are all uncomfortable conversations to have. And if you haven't worked those muscles or had practice in those spaces, it feels really unnatural to have those conversations. But wading into the discomfort, wading into the problem, and working it through with people who can give you advice and coaching is really part of the job.
That was kind of something I was thinking about, is because it seems like dealing with disruptive behavior seems to be a very commonly identified learning need for leaders. And do you think it's a universal problem, or do some people naturally handle these things well?
I think it is a universal problem. I think no one is born knowing how to handle these difficult situations. I don't think it's something innate. The people who are better at it, I think, have practiced it more. And, maybe they practiced it in their life before they were a physician. Maybe they practice it at home with their families or their kids or their neighbors, or maybe they've been through high conflict situations, so they've worked those muscles, and as a result have good instincts. But it's something that everybody has to learn, and there's almost no better way to learn than to go through it. So I'm sure folks listening to the podcast who have had to deal with disruptive behavior in their workplaces will be nodding along right now, just saying you learn so much more by living it and having to have those tough conversations yourself. I mean, I could give lots of tips about what that's going to look like and feel like, but until you do it, it's hard to know what a good conversation is going to feel like and what a not so good conversation is going to feel like. And I think it's also important for people to have expectations, realistic expectations for themselves. So for leaders who are new to dealing with disruptive behavior, or even just managing large groups of people, you're probably going to make some mistakes, and you're going to have some conversations that are not going to go well. But that's okay, and that's part of your learning journey as well. And the answer is just more practice. If you make a mistake, be accountable for it, follow up, make the correction. And again, that helps reinforce what the standard of behavior in your department is going to be. So if you have a conversation with two employees and it goes terribly, I think following up with them both to say, I feel really uncomfortable about our conversation yesterday. I meant to say this, and I'm worried that it came across like this. What you're modeling for them is open communication, caring, being able to admit when you've done something wrong. I mean, I think we've all been in workplaces where we've misspoken or said the wrong thing or potentially offended someone. But being accountable for that behavior is such an important part of relationship repair, and can really be a powerful, transformative force when you're talking about building a good workplace culture.
So, Laura, it sounds like there's a lot for people to learn, and I think there's a number of resources out there. So, do you have any final advice for our listeners as to where they should go, what they should do if they find themselves in a situation where they're dealing with disruptive behavior in the workplace?
Absolutely. I mean, my number one piece of advice is always if you don't know the answer, if the answer is not apparent to you, find the expert. Find the person who's going to be able to help or guide you. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the hospital, the health authority, the Faculty of Medicine, Dal's central HR department are all here to support clinical leaders. So absolutely reach out to HR, get some advice. Maybe it's just to talk through what you would do in a certain scenario or how you would approach. I mean, I often provide leaders with scripts. So if they're going into a meeting and they're saying, I don't know what to say, it's going to, they're new to these conversations, we will write you a bullet pointed script so you'll know all the points you need to. We can sit with you in the meeting. We can have a practice meeting. There's so many ways to get those muscles working and to start to feel comfortable in those, inherently uncomfortable situations. So I think accessing the HR resources available to you is a great way to start and just familiarize yourself with what those conversations and interactions might look like.
That's great. And for our listeners, we also have a course in faculty development at the medical school called Emerging Leaders in Academic Medicine. And one of our units is on productive conflict. So if anybody listening would like to learn more about that course, they can email facdev, FACDEV, @dal.ca. So I'd like to really thank you today, Laura, for coming in and for being a guest on this podcast. I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
And for our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Leadership PRN. If you have any ideas regarding topics for future episodes that you'd like to hear, feel free to reach out to me at lara.hazelton@nshealth.ca or lara.hazelton@dal.ca. Until then, thanks and take care.